The year is somewhere in the middle of the 19th century. Imagine London, its streets dimly lit by the flickering glow of gas lamps. The air is heavy with coal smoke, and the clatter of horse-drawn carriages echoes against tall, grey stone buildings. Behind lace curtains and heavy wooden doors, thousands of lives unfold, some grand, some humble, and many unnoticed. Among these lives are the single women of the Victorian age. They did not marry, whether by choice or by circumstance. To their neighbours they were often called spinsters, a word that carried a weight of judgment. But behind that simple label were complex, quiet lives that history rarely remembers. Tonight, we slow down and we wander gently through their world. Let us set the scene carefully, slowly, like one might arrange objects on a writing desk. There is the ticking of a clock, steady and patient. There is the faint rustle of skirts brushing against wooden floors. There is the crackling of a small fire in the hearth, and within this quiet space sits a woman 35 perhaps, or maybe 40. She is unmarried, and in her era that small fact defines much of her existence. In Victorian England, marriage was not just a personal choice, it was seen as a woman's duty. To remain single was to step outside of the expected order. For many families, daughters were encouraged to marry well, not simply for affection but for security, respectability and social standing. A husband meant stability. Without one, a woman was left adrift in the eyes of her society. And yet, not all women married. Some never received proposals. Others refused matches that were arranged for them. Some were widowed early, and some simply lived in a time where there were too many women and too few men to go around. A result of wars abroad and dangerous working conditions at home. The census records from the mid-1800s reveal this imbalance, whole towns where women outnumbered men. And so quietly, without grand announcements or dramatic scenes, many women found themselves living life on their own. Let us imagine a typical day. The sun rises slowly, its pale light spilling across a row of narrow terraced houses. A single woman, perhaps named Mary, wakes in her modest bedroom. The wallpaper is faded, patterned with roses. The sheets are plain cotton. On the small bedside table rests a worn copy of a book, perhaps a novel by Charlotte Bronte, or a volume of poetry. She dresses without the help of a maid, for unlike the wealthy, she cannot afford one. Her gown is simple, dark wool for the colder months, with a plain bonnet for modesty. She smooths her skirt carefully and steps into the quiet street. If Mary is fortunate, she may have her own small income, perhaps from an inheritance or from careful savings. If not, she must work. Many unmarried women found positions as governesses, teaching the children of wealthy families. Others worked as seamstresses, stitching dresses late into the night for little pay. Some ran small shops or took in lodgers or laboured as servants. Society was rarely kind to the unmarried woman. The word spinster itself comes from the occupation of spinning thread, a task once common for unmarried women in earlier centuries. By the Victorian period, it had become an insult, a label suggesting that a woman had been left behind, unwanted, incomplete. Newspapers and magazines sometimes mocked such women, portraying them as bitter, fussy, or overly pious. Even in literature, the spinster was often a side character, an object of pity or ridicule. And yet, these stereotypes rarely reflected the quiet strength of real women who lived alone. Respectability was everything in Victorian England. For a single woman, the line between being seen as respectable or improper was thin. To live alone was considered suspicious. To walk the streets too freely invited gossip. Many unmarried women sought to protect their reputations carefully, dressing modestly, speaking cautiously, and avoiding unnecessary attention. Church attendance was one way of maintaining respectability. Sundays filled pews with unmarried women, often sitting quietly together. Religion offered structure, community, and a shield against judgment. At the same time, some churches quietly pitied these women, preaching sermons about the virtues of marriage and motherhood, as though singleness were a flaw to be corrected. For many, the choices were narrow. Respectable employment for women was rare, and the fields open to them were poorly paid. Governesses, seamstresses, shop assistants, and domestic servants formed the backbone of female labour. Unlike men, Women could not easily enter law, medicine, or politics. The professions were closed to them, the doors barred by both custom and law. A seamstress might sit at her table from dawn until candlelight, stitching dress after dress. Her pay was so small that many barely earned enough to cover food and rent. In winter, her fingers grew stiff with cold, yet still she sewed. In families of modest means, an unmarried daughter was sometimes seen as a burden. Without a husband, she did not bring wealth or connections. If she did not work, she depended on the household's resources. Brothers might resent the cost of supporting her. Parents might speak in hushed tones of her failure to marry. And yet, many such women became the hidden support of their families. They cared for aging parents, helped raise nieces and nephews, and managed household duties. In quiet rooms, many unmarried women turned to letter writing. It was the great solace of the 19th century. Pens scratched across paper, filling pages with thoughts, prayers, and confidences that could not be spoken aloud. Friendships formed across miles, carried by the postal service that expanded steadily through the Victorian years. For some, these letters were the closest they came to intimacy. In them, women confessed their fears of old age, their struggles with finances, and their reflections on faith. Though the stereotype was of the lonely spinster, not all lived entirely alone. In many towns, boarding houses offered rooms to single women. In such places, quiet communities formed. Several women might share a building, cooking meals together, helping with one another's chores, and sitting by the fire in the evenings. These households of women, though overlooked by their neighbours, created a kind of chosen family. They shared laughter, gossip, and support. In some ways, they were freer here than they would have been in a husband's home. No one demanded they give birth. No one silenced their conversations. No one forced them into roles they did not choose. Within their small walls, they could simply be. Time moved gently for the Victorian single woman. Days were measured not in great events, but in small rhythms. The turning of seasons, the changing of fashions, the aging of neighbours. For some, there was always the lingering hope of marriage, even into later years. For others, there was acceptance, sometimes peaceful, sometimes tinged with sorrow. Old age for the unmarried could be difficult, especially without savings or family to support them. Some entered workhouses, those grim institutions meant for the destitute. Others lived with relatives, their presence tolerated but not always welcomed. And yet there were those who found contentment. They read, they gardened, they walked slowly through parks. They lived lives that were small in the eyes of history, but full in their own quiet way. By the later decades of the 19th century, a small but growing shift began to appear. Discussions about women's education, work, and independence entered public debate. Campaigners for women's rights argued that a woman's worth should not rest solely on marriage. Universities began, slowly, to open their doors. Women's colleges were established, offering education previously denied. Employment in teaching and nursing expanded, creating new avenues for single women to support themselves respectably. Though society still judged the spinster harshly, there were cracks in the old order. Some began to speak of the new woman, educated, independent, and unafraid of remaining single. For many unmarried women of the Victorian age, this change came too late, but it planted seeds for the generations to come. The Victorian single woman lived at the margins of her culture. Victorian society never stopped watching unmarried women. Neighbours whispered if a woman lived alone. Church members pitied her if she grew old without family. Polite company often treated her with a kind of condescension, offering sympathy instead of respect. The gaze could be suffocating. A woman who walked too often alone in the park, or who travelled without companions, risked being seen as odd or even improper. Victorian houses were cold places. Large homes looked grand from the outside, but servants usually slept in tiny attic rooms with thin blankets and weak candles. Their work never truly ended. A kitchen maid spent her day peeling potatoes, scrubbing dishes, cleaning ashes, and carrying heavy pans through narrow hallways. Housemaids polished furniture endlessly, dusting, polishing, sweeping, and polishing again. Even wealthy homes were dusty. The repetitive labour seemed endless. Many unmarried women also worked in textile factories. Inside these factories, the air was warm, noisy, and filled with floating fibres. Machines clattered hour after hour. Women stood for long periods beside spinning machines or sewing stations. Their hands became rough from constant work. Factory shifts often lasted 12 hours or longer. There were few breaks. Meals were simple and repetitive. Bread, tea, porridge, thin soup. Meat was expensive for poor workers, so many unmarried women rarely tasted it. Some unmarried women found work as seamstresses. This work looked gentler from the outside, but it was incredibly tiring. The seamstress spent long hours bent over fabric beside dim candlelight or weak gas lamps. Needle in, needle out, stitch after stitch. Victorian dresses were complicated garments with layers of fabric, buttons, ribbons, and lace. A single dress could take many days to finish. The work damaged eyesight and caused back pain, yet thousands of women depended on sewing to survive. People often used the unpleasant phrase spinster to describe older unmarried women. Marriage was seen as a woman's main goal. A woman who remained unmarried into her late 20s or 30s sometimes faced pity or gossip. Relatives frequently asked questions. Why had she not married? Was she too poor, too shy, too plain? Victorian society could be very cruel about such things. Still, many unmarried women quietly built independent lives despite social pressure. Some unmarried women worked in shops as clerks or assistants. Department stores became increasingly popular in late Victorian London. These shops sold gloves, hats, ribbons, books, perfumes, and fabrics. Their feet often ached terribly by evening. They were expected to appear respectable and calm at all times. Smiling was part of the job. Yet wages remained low. Many women carefully budgeted every penny: bread, rent, coal, tea. Life was calculated week by week. Leisure time was limited. Still, unmarried women found small moments of enjoyment. Unmarried women walking home from work often moved carefully through crowded, foggy streets, while horse carriages rolled past slowly. For some unmarried women, office work offered greater independence than domestic service. Women's education also slowly improved. Some women attended colleges or became teachers. The idea that women could build careers gradually became more accepted. Though progress was slow, still, life remained difficult for many. A serious illness could destroy a woman's financial stability completely. Old age also brought uncertainty. Without husbands or children to support them, some unmarried women feared poverty later in life. Many continued working for as long as possible. Victorian charity organisations attempted to help poor women through shelters, soup kitchens, or religious missions, yet charity often came with strict moral rules and judgment. The Victorian age was ending, a new century approached. Still, countless unmarried women continued their familiar routines. Waking early, boiling tea, walking through foggy streets, sewing by candlelight, standing behind shop counters. Their lives were not glamorous, but they endured quietly through one of history's largest and busiest cities. And tonight, as we slowly leave the smoky streets of Victorian London behind us, we remember these ordinary women whose lives unfolded in tiny rented rooms, crowded kitchens, narrow alleyways, and softly lit workshops. Lives filled not with adventure or luxury, but with routine. Endless routine. The quiet rhythm of footsteps on wet cobblestones, the sound of distant church bells through fog, the warmth of bread and tea after a long working day, and somewhere in a cold little room beneath the rooftops of London, a woman carefully extinguishes her candle before sleep, while the great city outside continues moving slowly through the night.